Hello and welcome to our webinar Assessing Groups of Chemicals, What You Need to Know. My name is Jonathan Küster, and together with my colleague Christelle Tissier, we will guide you through this webinar today. So what can you expect from today? Well, we want to explain to you how our assessments of regulatory needs actually work, how we assess these groups of substances. We want to give you some very practical tips, how you can find information on our website. And especially if you are a registrant, if you are a company active in the chemical sector, we want to give you some advice what to do when one of the substances that you're working with is actually included in one of our assessments. And of course, this being a webinar, we will give you the opportunity to ask us some questions and we will answer. Coming to that, as always with our webinars, you can go to slido.com, put in the event code #reg_needs. You can also use the direct link that you find in the webinar section on our webpage, and you can send these questions from 11 to 13 Helsinki time. After that, if your question has not been answered, if you're watching the webinar later on, you can always contact us via our web form, via our homepage. Also, after the webinar, the video, the presentations, and with a bit of delay, also the Q&A, so basically the Slido chat, will be available on the webinar section on our homepage. After this introduction, I will explain you a bit about regulatory needs, what you need to know about our work on groups. And after that, my colleague Christelle will guide you through the more practical sides, how these assessments look in practice, what you can do if you are industry and one of your substances is in our assessments. And Christelle will also do the wrap up. And as I said earlier, our webinar is open for your questions from 11 to 13 Helsinki time. So, assessments of regulatory needs. What do you need to know about our work on groups? First, we wanted to give you a bit of context. Basically, the machinery linking REACH and the CLP processes is our integrated regulatory strategy. And on this infograph, you can see how the different pieces of the machine are working together. Basically, it starts from registered substances, from CNL notified substances, and so on. And it continues with a grouping, which then is the basis of our assessments of regulatory needs. And from there, you will see if, for example, we need more data, we have processes, formal processes like dossier evaluation, substance evaluation, and so on to find additional information, to generate more information. Once this information is available, it goes back to our assessments of regulatory needs, and we either can assess and decide that for the moment there is no further need for action, or we put the substances or the groups forward into the formal processes for risk management, for example, into CLH, SVHC identification, and so on. What we really want to underline is that our work on groups is an informal process. It serves to link the formal official regulatory processes, but it is also very much at the core of our work, at the core of our integrated regulatory strategy. So that said, the work on groups is at the core. It helps us to find substances that require regulatory action. It helps us to find those substances for which we need additional information. And we use the chemical universe to track our progress. And we use, for example, the annual integrated regulatory strategy report to present more details. Now, this is the chemical universe. You might have seen this on our website already. This is a tool that helps especially authorities to map the progress in regulating chemicals of concern. We are mapping every registered substance to one of these so-called regulatory pools based on the planned, ongoing, or concluded regulatory actions. Basically, the aim is, looking from the left to the right, to reduce over time the gray bubble to assess all those substances, to have a look at them that so far have not been looked at, and then move via data generation if needed, via risk management processes if needed, to a situation where we basically have regulated them either in a way that safe use can be ensured, or that we can say for the time being we do not need to take any action. And you find more information on this on our website, but you also find more information on in our annual IRS report that is also available on our website. Why do we work on groups? Well, for many substances over the years, we have realized if there's a potential concern, there's already actions ongoing. Some regulatory actions are identified, proposed, are ongoing, and so on, often on the substances themselves, but also very often on a related substance. So if we work on groups, we are able to treat these related substances consistently. We address them all at the same time. Also, we pool the information that we have on them, so we can proceed faster. We don't need to wait for each individual substance to be 100% compliant, to have data available for all of them. We can move forward despite data gaps. We, with our work on groups, increase the predictability of our actions, because once we move ahead with one substance, we also continue with the related ones in the same vein. And that also helps support informed substitution or avoids regrettable substitution. So with this work on groups, we can act earlier, more holistically, and also more transparently. Speaking of transparency, what do we do to make our work more transparent? Well, so far, our communication has been rather limited on our work on groups of substances. We have a generic information on our website on working with groups. We don't have information, or we did not so far have information on the substances we assess together, so about this group context. And we did not have information on actually the outcomes of our assessment. There was some communication, for example, via the annual IRS report. We brought statistics, we brought examples, but you would not get the full picture. Also, in the chemical universe, the outcome of our group's assessment would play a role. For example, assignment to a certain pool could be due to the outcome of a group assessment. However, you would not be able to see that, so there was no further explanation available publicly, and that is why we're now moving ahead with a more transparent approach. So why more transparency? In general, transparency has a very high value for ECHA. It is one of the core aims of the chemical strategy for sustainability. For example, in the context of one substance, one assessment, and to quote the chemical strategy for sustainability, it says to have a simpler and more transparent process in order to reduce the burden on all stakeholders and to make decision-making faster, as well as more consistent and predictable. So indeed, the CSS recognizes this importance of transparency, and also ECHA, we ourselves, in our core values, recognize this. Transparency is the first among 5: independency, trustworthiness, efficiency, and our commitment to well-being. From the perspective of our work, from the perspective of the assessment of regulatory needs that we've been doing, this is a very important share of our work that so far has not been visible. By today, we have assessed around 3,400 substances, but you would not find substance-specific information, except, like I said earlier, in the chemical universe or the annual IRS report, let's say punctual, not comprehensive. Since last week, since the 7th of December, we started publishing the first of our assessments, and our aim is to gradually move ahead, publish all of our assessments, not only the ones that we've been doing so far, but also the ones that we're working on now and that we will be working on in the future. We also realized that it is very difficult to communicate at a general level on this work done. For example, in the IRS report, it's only possible to communicate there based on examples, but the concrete assessments of groups of substances still need to be made public. Also, transparency is important from the industry perspective. Like I mentioned earlier, to support informed substitution, if you, as a registrant, need to make use of the structural similarity and the assessments that we've been doing, if you're looking for an alternative substance because your substance is in the process of being regulated, then it will help you to see what we're planning. It increases the predictability. So you can see, as a registrant, as industry, what we're planning to do, not only on the substance you have registered, but also on those that you might use for substitution. And if you are able to prepare, we also, from our authority side, can refer to the fact that you had more time to provide sufficient data. So from our side, both for industry and for authorities, it allows to prepare, it enables faster action, and hopefully leads to less surprises. So we've been taking more steps towards more transparency throughout this year. In summer, we have updated some information on our website. We've updated the infographic that you've seen in the very beginning of this presentation. We have a new page on the assessment of regulatory needs, which replaces the old RMOA page. We have a page explaining in general the approach and grouping, and since last week, we have started to actually publish the assessments of regulatory needs on PACT. And we also have a new list dedicated to these assessments of regulatory needs, which includes the old RMOAs, but also our group assessments. And today, we have this webinar to introduce the changes and our efforts to you, but we also publish a new Q&A during this week on the assessments of regulatory needs. Now I would like to give you a little walkthrough what is actually available on our website, what and where can you find information on PACT and on this assessments of regulatory needs list. If you go to our homepage, the easiest way is actually to scroll very quickly to the very, very bottom of the page. It has a huge collection of very useful and interesting shortcuts. Two among them is PACT and is the assessment of regulatory needs list. Starting with PACT, the Public Activities Coordination Tool. This is a service that gives you an overview of the planned, ongoing, and past activities, substance by substance, what has been done by ECHA and member states under REACH and CLP. You can find the activities per substance. You see there are different numbers per activity and per substance. You can click on these numbers, you get more information, and you see the column ARN. This is the assessments of regulatory needs, and there you get more details on the work we're presenting today. You can also go to the assessment of regulatory needs list. This also functions substance by substance, and it gives you some extended filter options. For example, you can filter for the proposed follow-up, so the next action. You can filter by authority if you want to know what ECHA has been doing, what other member states have been doing, and so on. And you can filter for some very specific things that we have been working on in our group's assessment. For example, the group name, the foreseen regulatory needs, so the longer term regulatory action that we're foreseeing, and other things. And my colleague Christelle will come back to those details later on. If you click on the little I button, you get to details per substance. For example, in this case, you see on the assessment of regulatory needs list, you see the RMOAs, some done by member states, some done by us. You see a substance, you see some initial information. On the right-hand side, you see the little I button. If you click that, you get even more details. You can see the follow-up, so the next proposed action. You can see the foreseen regulatory need. This is the longer term foreseen action that we think at this point in time is necessary. You get access to the actual report. You can download it. And in this report, you also find a list of the other substances in that group, and you find the group name. And again, especially about the report, the document, my colleague Christelle will tell you more later on. With that, I would like to thank you and hand over to Christelle.
So thanks, Jonathan, for the introduction to the assessment of regulatory needs. And good morning, everyone. I will now introduce to you what are actually those assessment of regulatory needs and what we are doing in ECHA when we look at those groups. So first, very quickly, how do we work on the groups in ECHA, but not also that this is a work that can be done by member state. So we start from a list of groups that are created internally based on structural similarity. Those groups are looked at by a team of experts in ECHA, having some hazard colleague, a risk management colleague, and chemist. And colleagues will look and assess the regulatory needs for the group of substances. We will go a bit more in detail in the rest of my presentation, but I will also explain that this assessment is actually an iterative assessment. There are several steps based on the information that is available to us. The ultimate aim is actually for all substances within those groups to be able to conclude that there is a need for risk management. So to move those substances to the pool of substances risk management ongoing, or to actually conclude that there is currently no need for further action on the substances. You will see also that we will identify then action for some of those substances under risk management ongoing, and those action can be done actually either by ECHA or member state. Typical action could be, for instance, harmonized classification and labeling, which is something that can be done by member state, or proposing a restriction. But what are we doing under those assessment of regulatory needs? So it's really work that is there to support authorities to conclude on the most appropriate way to address the identified concern for a group of substances or for single substances. What we look at, what the experts look at are hazards, information, uses, and in particular the potential for exposure to both human and the environment from those uses. We look at group boundaries and the need, for instance, to subgroup within a group, and also to some extent to the potential for substitution that we can get from information on the structure of those substances or the uses. The main source of information is the registration dossier. We have also put in place a system where we actually consult with member states before we publish the report on PACT. And the idea with the consultation is actually to provide input, suggestion to the way we propose for the group of substances, but also to raise awareness as early as possible on potential candidate for regulatory risk management so that member states are aware of the work ongoing. As said in the previous slide, the assessment of regulatory needs is an iterative assessment. So we do for all those groups a first assessment, which is actually done at the screening level and where we really focus on what is available to us in the registration information, being from the hazard data perspective or from the use perspective. From there, we conclude on the next immediate action, which is usually data generation. For some groups, we can already say that there is currently no need for action. And in some cases, we have also proposed risk management, for instance, harmonized classification and labeling. One thing to note is that at this stage of assessment, we actually don't assess as such the read across or the category approach that may be available in a registration dossier. This is done only during official processes, for instance, as part of the compliance check. The depth of the assessment and the knowledge on the substances will increase in further iteration. So, for instance, if data generation is the first step, there will be some generation of hazard, which will allow us to know actually more about the hazard of those substances. And at the next steps, we can revise the assessment to take this new information into account. Some benefits from our side on this work. So I will not repeat what Jonathan has introduced at the beginning. So there are clear benefits from the grouping. But in addition, several benefits that we can see from our side in doing this work quite upfront. So we really see that this early in the identification of the most appropriate regulatory tools to address the concern identified will allow immediate action being possible after the first assessment. For instance, we clearly from this work identify from time to time the need for CLH. So this can be initiated as soon as we identify that. So no need to wait, for instance, first to generate data. It allows us also to identify actually those, what we would see as action in the future if the hazard is confirmed. So when the data comes back, we know already what to do. And if it's confirmed, we can go much quicker to an harmonized classification or a restriction. We have identified that already in the early stage. Member states are aware. So as soon as the hazard is clarified, we can go directly to those actions. Furthermore, what we have noticed is that it helps also focusing the generation of data to those endpoint substances where we have actually identified a concern and the need for regulatory risk management action. So as said before, it really speeds up regulatory risk management action after this generation of data. And as mentioned also, as we have this communication with member states and we are working together, it also ensures early identification and communication of possible cases to member states. Some expectation also on industry. So as said, the work is based on information in the registration dossier. So the better the information we have and the most up-to-date we have, the more appropriate we are able to conclude on the need for action or not. So it's really important that there is good quality of the registration dossier. And that's clearly a message also to you today, that please keep up to date your dossier so that we have a solid basis to take a decision for the need for further action. We will now publish our assessment, so there is really an opportunity for you to actually clarify the potential hazard and use profile of your substances early on before any action is actually initiated. So it's about this predictability of action. And this is valid both from industry and authority, so that we all focus on actually the right substances. Some maybe action that you can take also from your side is that you will see that we foresee some regulatory risk management. As said, sometimes those will be immediate action. In other time, those will be once we have clarity on the hazard. But in any case, it should give you also some incentive to potentially look for alternative in case you have also identify yourself that some of your substances would be hazardous. We usually look at a full group of structurally similar substances. So from there, you may also give indication whether some similar substances within the group are safer or will be also subject to regulatory risk management. So hopefully it provides you some help also in providing you more predictability in terms of substitution as well. What was and what is our main aim when publishing those reports? And I will go next also to introduce a bit more to you what you can find in those reports. So in ECHA, we really wanted to make clear what we foresee as next action on a group of substances. So we have tried to make this very clear in our report. As said, we don't focus only on the immediate next action, let's say first compliance check for many substances, but also really after that, if the hazard is confirmed, where would we like to bring that substances? What is our end goal in terms of regulatory risk management? And you will see that for some substances, the end goal will be the need for EU regulatory risk management, but for some others, it will be no need. So from the report, you should get this also very clear. But we will also make very clear what is the immediate next action. So the document really will include all action identified and also which substances have been assessed together. As said before, our grouping, as you may have seen already in some of the published report, is different from a read across. It allows us mainly to look at those substances together. So going now really to the core of the reports. So quickly, the content of the report, and I will go a bit more in detail of what you find and how we have also structured the information in those. So we have, in general, a cover page with some information on the group structure and an overview of the substances. We have a disclaimer, a foreword, explaining what is the purpose of the document. And then we have more the core information about the group. An overview of the group, which I will explain a bit more later. The justification for the need or no need for regulatory risk management, and a summary of conclusion and action in the form of a table, and then few annexes. But I will go now a bit more in detail using actually an example to make it more concrete. So what will you see in the report? So as said, all reports will have this cover page where we make clear who has done the work. So in this case, ECHA, the date, so that you get an idea actually when we have extracted the data in registration dossier to support our assessment. You will see that some of those assessments we publish now have actually been done some time ago, but we have kept the date when we have extracted the data so that you are aware on which basis we have done our assessment. So some report will appear potentially as 2020, so don't be surprised about that. We have then the group name. When possible, we will put a general structure and then some versioning. As said, it will be an iterative assessment. So now this is the first version for this report. There will be other potentially later on, once, for instance, we have gathered all information. Then you will see the overview of all substances within the group. So usually you will see quite a long table, depending how many members we have in those groups, with identifiers for the substance, chemical structures, and some registration information. Of course, everything that we publish is non-confidential information. The content, so I will not go back too much in detail of that, as I introduced it earlier. The disclaimer and the foreword. So the disclaimer is a usual disclaimer, as we have in many of our documents, mainly about liability regarding the document. I think most important is the foreword, where you get some understanding of what are those assessment of regulatory needs and what they are not. You can find here also a link to our website where you find even more information. But might be good to read this forward to understand what is actually an assessment of regulatory need. Then to the core of the assessment. So you will see first this overview of the group. So what information you will find in there is usually some information on the group as such. So how many substances, what is the basis for the grouping? For instance, in that case, was the presence of a special moiety, this cyclic acetal. You will have also information on the structure, any subgrouping that may have been done by the colleagues based on the chemistry. And then you will have, if available, some information, for instance, on any ongoing activities being substance evaluation, or if there would be harmonized classification and labeling available or ongoing, as this is the case in that examples. Then you will get also a short summary of the uses for all the substances in the group, and in particular where we have noted a potential for exposure to human health or the environment, and any reference, for instance, to professional workers, industrial workers, or any release to the environment. So this will be provided in all of the report. We have also added a note to actually again clarify the scope of our assessment. So you will find this note in all reports, and one part of the note clarify what is the focus of our work, and explain that the main focus and main basis for us to decide on the need for some regulatory risk management action is actually on some endpoints as listed in the note. It doesn't mean that the substances do not have other hazards, and that's why we have also provided in the report this Annex 1, where it's an overview of all classification. And the second part of the note is actually to explain also how far we have been in assessing this exposure potential. And as said before, this is based on information on registration dossier. And we use mainly information on uses as a proxy, at least in this first iteration of the assessment. Then you will find section 2, which is there to explain actually the action we foresee on the substances or the no action, and some justification. So the document, the justification will start with making it clear what we foresee as the last action on the group. And in that case, is a restriction combined with authorization. We will make clear also what is the basis for this action. So what is the concern? And in that case, is the fact that one substance has actually this classification as repro 1B and as potential for release and exposure. So that's the trigger for us to think of some further action. What you will see then is some more information to understand what has been the basis of our reflection, and why we and how we justify this action. So first, a short summary of the hazard assessment and the potential for exposure will be provided, so that you have some ideas. How did we come up with the need for action? Sometimes it's based on a known hazard. For instance, if there would be an harmonized classification, sometimes it will be a potential hazard, and we have tried to make it very clear. And this potential hazard is usually based on what we see in the registration information. And if it is a potential hazard, usually the first step will be to clarify it via a compliance check. But we try to make all this quite clear in the document so that you understand where we are in our assessment. Then we will explain actually what do we foresee as regulatory risk management, and we will list the different steps, but also what will be the impact of those steps. For instance, in that case, if the hazard is confirmed as repro 1B, the first step we foresee for these substances is actually harmonized classification. And what will this harmonized classification trigger is on one hand company-level risk management measures under the OSH legislation for workers. We will also specify that if we actually want to go, for instance, to authorization or restriction, this is the recommended first step under REACH. And it's, of course, also a prerequisite to restrict the presence of the substance in consumer as per restriction entry 30. So it already shows what will be the impact on the substance as such and the uses based on the CLH. We will also, as you can see in the last paragraph, identify any impact on other legislation, for instance, cosmetics in these specific cases. Then continuing in the examples, we will continue explaining the different action we propose. And you may remember that in that case, it was a restriction combined with authorization. So why we propose in such case a restriction, it's mainly to address the professional uses. And we explain why we think restriction would be the best way forward or the most appropriate way forward to address the concern we have with professional users using that substance. And finally, the last part for this specific case of the report will be for us to explain how do we think we should address the industrial uses, and in that case, we propose authorization. What we will try to do also in those reports is always to try to balance the different potential options. So you will find in those reports some discussion why we concluded that the most appropriate maybe at this point in time for us would be authorization. But some discussion on, for instance, why we think OEL would not be the most appropriate option, or maybe why we don't go for restriction on industrial uses. So you should find information on all this in the report. Then finally, all this will be summarized in a table that you can find under section 3, conclusion and action. So there you will find for each individual substances what we have considered as human health and environmental hazard, what are relevant use and exposure potential, the last foreseen action, a short summary of the justification that we have explained already before in section 2, and then clearly listed the different action we foresee. So as we discussed before, in that case, the first step will be compliance check for that substances, then harmonized classification, restriction for professional uses, SVHC identification, followed by authorization for industrial uses. So now on the screenshot, you see only the outcome for one substance. Of course, you will have in the table all substances covered under the report. What you will find also in the report are actually those annexes. So you will have an annex providing to you all harmonized classification. An annex also, which is an overview of the uses based on information in registration dossier, and an overview of completed or ongoing regulatory risk management activities. So that's what I wanted to tell you about the assessment of regulatory needs. I hope it was useful and gave you some more understanding of what we were aiming at with those reports. Short wrap-up from our side and some take-home messages from this webinar. So please, as said already, keep your registration up to date, because this is really our starting point for our work. We based all our conclusion and proposal on what we find in the registration that we have in our hand. With the first iteration of the assessment, you will see what we have considered. As said, most dossier, we say compliance check first, as we need more hazard information to get clarity on that before we initiate any regulatory risk management action. So you will have also time to update after the first iteration. So please also follow PACT regularly to see whether there is an assessment of regulatory needs for your substances. And in general, we would also recommend to follow the updates of the annual IRS report and the chemical universe, where you can get some more information in general on what we do on the groups, but also more substance-specific information, for instance, when it comes to the chemical universe. And remember that, of course, we have plenty of substance-specific information on the PACT, but also on our website, we have quite some information on the work we do on the groups, on the assessment of regulatory needs, and you will find also some Q&As, which hopefully will answer most of your questions. Now there will be the Q&A panel. So please, I'm sure some of you have started to send questions. Please continue. So the webinar is open until 1 Helsinki time. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but if your question is not answered at the end, please send it via our contact form so that we can also deal with it after the webinar. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and looking forward to your question.